What I have prepared today is some thoughts on primarily the ethical and legal challenges of what we're calling neuroprediction. And I'm really just considering neuroprediction in the fairly narrow sense that Federica emphasized in her introduction, namely the uses of various kinds of information, including now maybe neuroscience evidence, to determine whether somebody is likely to recidivate, is likely to be a danger during their, whether you can grant them bail, whether they're eligible for parole, all the different ways that the courts use predictive information to decide on their treatment of offenders, predicting how dangerous they're likely to be in the future. Probably used many more words in that sentence than was necessary, but anyway. So basically what I want to say is that I won't have anything to say about the really interesting findings of Ariel, the idea that we can distinguish between different kinds of disorders and the ways to intervene and reduce the dangerousness of these kinds of people. Some of Kent's work was directly aimed at predicting recidivism. Other was more generally, like what kind of mental illness does this person have, and what are the implications of that for their future dangerousness, and so forth. Okay, I'm gonna just try to think narrowly about neuroprediction in the sense of, okay, here's this offender, what's he or she likely to do in terms of criminal behavior in the coming years. So the question I want to focus even more narrowly on now is whether there are any challenges that are specific to neuroprediction as opposed to other kinds of prediction, the kinds of prediction that are routinely made in courtrooms, based on demographic information, criminal history, and so forth. So what special ethical and legal challenges are raised by neuroprediction? And I'm going to suggest, and this is an idea I'm trying out. This is a good audience to try it out with. You can correct me if you think I'm wrong. I'm going to suggest that there really aren't any special issues. That there are certainly serious ethical challenges associated with any kind of prediction in a criminal justice context, but nothing special about adding neuro to the mix. So what I'm going to do now is review some of the challenges that come from statistical approaches to predicting behavior in general, from the use of statistical approaches in the criminal justice context, and then close with a couple of quick thoughts about, is there anything else that we need to take into account when we go to neuroprediction? Okay, so prediction and statistics. I want to say that, predicting is a pretty simple, in principle, it's a pretty simple statistical matter of just estimating the value of some unknown variable based on the variables that you do know. So, let's see. Is that? Oh yeah, good. Okay. So basically, I've got some measures that I'm going to use to predict the outcome that I'm interested in. And I am going to gather, as part of my research, the outcomes that I want to predict, and then I will have a model of the relationship between those. Okay, I'll
Do you have a pointer on your computer?
Thank you. See? Another Nobel Prize for, thank you, for PowerPoint technique. Yes, okay. Okay, so we've got some predictor variables, and we've got the outcome that we want to predict. We make a model of the relationship between those, and then the idea is we can predict some new, predict the outcome associated with some new value, say that one there, by using this model to say, okay, that's going to have that value on the predicted variable. This is almost so basic it's silly to walk through it, but I do want to say that in most cases it does not make any difference whether what you're predicting is something that is data that already exists. You might just not have it in hand at the moment, or whether it's something that will happen in the future. There are special kinds of models involving time series analysis if there's some sort of pattern over time that you want to capture. But basically, that's not what anybody here is talking about. We're just talking about, how do you estimate what's going to happen based on what you already know? Okay, so what are the issues? What are the challenges with that? Well, there are basically, pretty simple statistical modeling challenges. We may underestimate the error, or we may overestimate how good our prediction is. Statisticians call this optimism, which is kind of a funny word for something that's bad. But the idea is that if you underestimate the error in your model, then you will be overly optimistic about how good the model is and how trustworthy future predictions are. Typically that comes about because people are just fitting a model to all of their data and then saying, look at the scatter plot. Look, the correlation is, 0.8 or something amazing. And that is absolutely true. The correlation is 0.8, but what we don't know is if we then took new data, whether, how good the prediction would be. I guess that's clear. So initially what you want to do is, given that these kinds of data can be expensive to collect, certainly, as generous as Kent is with his offer to, just drive his trailer up to wherever it's needed and scan people, these kinds of data aren't that easy to get. So initially what makes sense is to split the data into parts, maybe into halves, into quarters, or even just everything but one and leave one out, and test how well you can predict the data that you haven't based your model on from the data that you have based your model on. That's called cross-validation. But ultimately, before you're going to use these kinds of predictive techniques for anything that's really high stakes, which would include, somebody's liberty, whether they're how long they're going to go to jail for or whatever, you want to test this with new data. Okay. So that's kind of the humble empirical kind of challenge, but there are ethical issues. LCs are ethical, legal, and societal issues. There are LCs that come from these statistical challenges. The most obvious one is just just getting a model that's accurate is not so easy, particularly particularly because in most cases we don't have the results of testing with new data. And I believe that's true with all of the neuroprediction. I could be wrong. I know Kent and some of his collaborators have done some cross-validation, which is a huge, giant step in the right direction. Still, you want to know what happens with totally new data. This need for accuracy is kind of an obvious issue. It's even might seem funny to even call it an ethical issue. It's just like you want the thing to work well, of course. But from a consequentialist point of view, accuracy is key because it's going to tell you how many people you're saving by having dangerous people off the streets versus how many people you're unnecessarily, locking up or limiting the freedom of in other ways with your method. So you want low error rates. You also want unbiased error rates. So you can have an overall error rate. You can have overall false positives and false negatives for the population at large. You can also inquire, does your method give equivalent accuracy for different subpopulations, for example, different racial groups and ethnic groups? And that is a question that's been asked about some of the methods for predicting recidivism, and we'll come back to that in a sec. So you want them, obviously, you want them low and unbiased. You don't really need a, professor of ethics from the philosophy department to tell you that. You also want known error rates and known bias, and that's not so trivial to achieve either. Okay. Just let me just leave that there. So there are also some non-consequentialist ethical issues, which consist of, how and whether and why it's okay to treat an individual in a certain way, including depriving them of their freedom or depriving them of their freedom for longer, based on a statistical fact about a whole bunch of other people who aren't that person, right? So, I was looking for kind of broad categories to stick this in, and I think that really goes under a rights consideration. And, we can talk about the moral import of that when the population is a discriminated against group and when it's not, okay? I think even when it's not, it might be a significant issue. But I'm also going to say that from here on in, I'm going to focus on the consequentialist issues. I do believe that these issues here are just going to be the same, whether or not we're classifying or predicting based on brain or behavior or something else. Again, feel free to disagree. I want to be educated here. Okay, so going from just very kind of generic statistical prediction in the abstract to more specifically the way prediction is carried out in the criminal justice system, I'm going to mention different ways that it's done. And again, I am really an amateur, know nothing about this professionally, so please, legal experts and others, correct me if I'm wrong. But one way that judges make determinations of how long somebody should be locked up, for example, or whether they should be freed on bail, is based on experts. A forensic psychologist comes in and examines the person and looks at their history and whatever else and says, okay, in my professional judgment, I think this person is a real threat and definitely don't let him out on bail. Now, at some level, there's statistics baked into that too, right? This is the person's generalizations from what they've learned over the years. It may be quite biased, we don't know. And in general, I don't think there are like scorecards for different forensic psychologists that tell you, like, how often they've been right or wrong predicting future dangerousness, let alone, you know, whether there's bias in those predictions. So so those you know, those same issues of accuracy and bias come up with experts. There are actuarial systems, which is a word I think that Kent raised earlier. And these tend to take into account things like age, the age of the person, the age at which they began committing crimes, the, you know, drug abuse problems, mental illness, and so forth. The very things that Kent was talking about. And those are also used, in fact, yeah, just enough said. And do we know how accurate they are or what level of bias they cause? No, we don't. Finally, a recent, very interesting development is what I'll call computationally souped up actuarial systems that use, you know, really powerful statistics, including machine learning methods, to try to find the kind of the best model, given the input data available, to predict future dangerousness. And again, we have to ask the same question: how accurate, how biased? And that's what I'm going to focus on, because that's really, you know, in terms of our march toward ever more novel and scientific methods of forensic prediction, I think this is kind of the last stop in currently practiced methods before we go to neuroprediction. So how good are these methods? Well, here's something from a seminar that was held at, I guess it was at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where Shirley Jackson is the president. She was interviewing Chief Justice John Roberts, and, you know, being a sort of engineering technology person, she asked him, can you see a day when smart machines driven with artificial intelligence will assist with courtroom fact-finding, or more controversially, even judicial decision-making? And Justice Roberts says, it's a day that's here, and it's putting a significant strain on how the judiciary goes about doing things. Okay. And I take it he's referring here to these souped up risk estimating systems. Okay, so souped up risk estimating systems, putting these decisions in the hands, so to speak, of algorithms rather than, you know, a judge or a justice with, you know, excellent wisdom and temperament and all that. It's kind of like, you say I'm statistically predicting, like it's a bad thing. Okay, some of you may know what the original word under statistically predicting is. So the question is, why do we think of high-tech prediction as a bad thing? Why do we have this ethical unease that Justice Roberts was expressing? Well, I think the issues are the same as the ones outlined earlier, both consequentialist and rights-based. And so I would say if your error rates are known, and if they're low and unbiased, then surely prediction, whether it's high-tech or otherwise, is a good thing, right? Okay, here's the thing. Transparency, known performance of the system, accuracy and bias are often problematic in this area. Okay, there are proprietary software programs including something called, COMPAS is the acronym. I have to go back here to see what it, Correctional Offender Management Profile for Alternative Sanctions. That's what COMPAS stands for. So COMPAS is marketed by a company. It's making money for the company, and the company says, well, we can't tell you how it works because that would be giving away our, valuable intellectual property. As for how accurate it is, different people have come to different conclusions, but the investigative journalism consortium ProPublica in 2016 concluded that it's actually not very accurate, and you can see that it fails in different ways for white and African American offenders in a way that puts African American offenders at a really substantial disadvantage. Okay, another question about COMPAS, which is widely used. Let me just quickly refer to somebody who knows more about this than I do. Jeffrey, help me out. Who uses COMPAS? It's in many states now, right? Or
well, some version of it.
Some version of it is.
There's a lot of. It's a crowded marketplace.
Okay.
There's a lot of people like North Point, but there are different models in different places.
Okay, thank you. Did everybody hear that? Yes. So what Jeffrey tells me is COMPAS and products like it, because it is a crowded marketplace, as he said, and I think it's good to be reminded of how essentially market-driven this is and profit-driven, are widely used. Okay. Another interesting finding about COMPAS is that not only does it do a pretty poor job predicting, you might say, well, gosh, prediction is hard. It's probably better than nothing. But in fact, a fascinating publication a couple of years ago by an undergraduate at Dartmouth with her computer science professor advisor showed that you can do as well with sort of random people recruited on MTurk. And for those of you who don't know what MTurk is, it's a platform for hiring for ridiculously low wages people to just do little online tasks for you. And psychologists use it a lot to get surveys answered and so forth. And Hani Farid and his student used it to get people to classify various scenarios, offender profiles. And they found that as good as COMPAS, and I think just using a sample of 40 folks was as good as COMPAS, and it actually showed less racial bias than COMPAS. Now, I don't want to bash COMPAS or things like it. I'm sure there are multiple sides to this story, but clearly it's a far from settled issue whether these error rates are known, are low, and are biased or not. Okay. So can neuroprediction help us out of this situation? Well, it's got a long way to go before it will meet the kinds of accuracy criteria that we've set our goals for the other prediction programs. And certainly it's just as liable to optimism errors and to bias. So you might think, oh, well, at least it won't have racial bias. Okay. But in fact, we know that brain structure and hence presumably brain function varies according to genetic ancestry factors, which are basically the sort of genetic marker for what we usually informally think of as racial categories. So it can easily sort of smuggle in racial confounds that way. I think it's good to anticipate the LCs, the ethical, legal, and societal issues with neuroprediction now. So again, thank you, Federica, thank you, colleagues, for doing that. But I don't think there are going to be any LCs that would be fundamentally different from those arising from more conventional approaches. I think it would be really interesting to look for them, maybe something with these seductive, so-called seductive allure of neuroscience, where people just believe anything that comes from brain imaging. I'm not sure that's really true anymore, but anyway, maybe there's something about the air of determinism that comes from like brain function that might, again, lead to a kind of, it might invite certain misunderstandings, but I don't think, my bottom line is I don't think there are any unique ethical issues that arise from neuroprediction. And so with that, I thank you. You know, I thought I was going to have too little to fill the time. Clearly, that was a bad prediction. Okay.